Simone Whitmore slid the divorce papers across a candlelit table and told her husband Darius that she was done carrying a man with no ambition. She believed her powerful boss billionaire chief executive Evelyn Hartwell was about to promote her and finance a glamorous new life. Darius signed the acknowledgement without protest, folded his napkin, and left the restaurant without raising his voice. What Simone did not know was that Evelyn's empire was hours away from collapse, and the only person authorized to approve, freeze, or cancel its $4 billion rescue loan was the husband she had just humiliated in public. By sunrise, every lie in that room would become unbearably expensive. The restaurant Simone chose sat in the heart of Atlanta, all low light and imported marble, the kind of place she had once dismissed as pretentious and now treated as proof of arrival. She had not picked it to save her marriage. She had picked it to be seen ending one to prove to herself that she had outgrown the life she used to share with Darius. He arrived in a simple charcoal suit, carrying a small wrapped box, a restored pocket watch that had belonged to her late father, the kind of gift that required patience and memory rather than money. Simone never opened it. She placed a folder on the table instead, thick with legal paper, and told him she was exhausted from 8 years of watching herself rise, while he stayed exactly where he had always been, working quietly from home, driving the same aging sedan, never once appearing beside her at the events that mattered. He asked calmly if there was someone else. She said there was no affair in the way he meant it, but that Evelyn Hartwell had helped her finally see her own worth, had shown her rooms Darius would never be invited into. She told him Evelyn was preparing to name her chief executive of a subsidiary once a $4 billion loan closed, and that she had already been offered a company-owned apartment as the first sign of the life waiting for her. Darius asked if she had read the loan terms carefully. Simone laughed at the question. Certain a small-time risk consultant like her husband could not possibly understand a transaction of that size, and pushed the folder closer, demanding he sign away any claim to bonuses, equity, or the house she believed she had mostly paid for herself. She spoke of the years, like a ledger she had been keeping in silence, listing every dinner he skipped, every industry gala where she stood alone, answering questions about a husband nobody had ever met every time a colleague asked what Darius actually did for a living, and she had to shrug because she genuinely did not know the full answer. She told him she had spent nearly a decade convincing herself that ambition skipped a generation in their household, that she alone carried the weight of building something, and that watching him remain unbothered by his own stagnation had slowly curdled her admiration into something closer to contempt. Darius listened without interrupting, aware that correcting her in that moment would only sound like an excuse, and aware, too, that some of what she said carried a grain of truth he could not entirely dismiss, since he had chosen distance long before she ever did. He read every page in silence, recognizing the fingerprints of a law firm, with ties to Evelyn, noticing clauses buried deep inside that would strip him of any right to ever investigate the finances tied to Simone's new position. He signed only the acknowledgement of receipt, nothing more, then set the small box beside her untouched wine glass and told her that by tomorrow she would know exactly whose signature she had just moved against. Simone mistook it for the last desperate line of a man losing his wife. Outside, beneath the restaurant's awning, Darius called his attorney Rochelle Pierce and said only that the Hartwell file needed to be frozen immediately, that not $1 could move until he had reviewed it himself, and Rochelle reminded him the loan's deadline was 14 hours away. While Simone raised a celebratory glass to Evelyn over the phone that night, the lending system at Whitmore Sovereign Capital quietly shifted the $4 billion facility from pending disbursement to suspended by order of the chairman. Darius did not go home to the bedroom he had shared with Simone for 11 years. He walked instead into a private study hidden behind a wall of bookshelves, logged into a secure terminal, and stepped fully into a role his own wife had never known existed. 16 years earlier, he had been a debt restructuring specialist at an investment bank, watching healthy companies get torn apart by lenders, chasing short-term profit instead of long-term survival. He had used his savings and a modest inheritance from his father to start a small fund built on strict discipline, offering capital to struggling businesses in exchange for real governance instead of quick extraction. The fund had grown into something enormous, but Darius kept his name off the public record, letting Rochelle represent an undisclosed board, while only a handful of senior partners knew he was the founder sitting at the center of it all. He had almost told Simone the truth. Once early in their marriage, until a distant relative tried to forge investment documents, after catching a glimpse of his growing wealth, and Darius decided silence was safer until he trusted the ground beneath them. He remembered watching his own father, handed a modest windfall late in life, only to see cousins, church friends, and even a brother line up with outstretched hands until the money and the relationships around it were both gone within 2 years. And he had promised himself he would never let wealth hollow out the people closest to him the same way. He never let Simone want for anything, either quietly paying off their mortgage, funding the leadership program that helped her rise, and building retirement accounts in her name that she assumed were simply the rewards of her own talent. There were nights early in the marriage when he almost told her everything when she would fall asleep against his shoulder, still wearing the modest blazer she wore to entry-level meetings, and he would lie awake, calculating whether truth would change how she looked at him. He always concluded the risk was not worth it yet, that a marriage needed years of ordinary trust before it could survive extraordinary money, and somewhere along the way, the right moment simply stopped arriving. He told himself he was protecting them both. He never considered that protecting a secret and protecting a marriage were not always the same task, and that the distance required to keep one intact would eventually widen into the very gap Simone would use to justify leaving. Rochelle sent him a summary of the Hartwell file that night, and it read like a warning written in numbers. Hartwell Meridian needed $4 billion to roll over debt coming due, had pledged 11 subsidiaries, as collateral showed revenue figures that did not match internal cash flow, and had already pledged some of those same assets to a separate lender. Simone's signature appeared on multiple public statements sent to investors, and Darius realized with a cold certainty that his estranged wife might be the person left holding the blame when everything collapsed. Rochelle urged him to separate the marriage from the mandate, and Darius agreed, choosing a full investigation over an impulsive cancellation that could cost thousands of ordinary employees their jobs. Across the city, Simone arrived at the luxury apartment Evelyn had promised her, only to be told by the building's manager that no formal transfer of rights had ever been approved. When she called Evelyn in confusion, the chief executive assured her everything would be finalized the moment the loan closed the next morning, then asked Simone to bring over copies of every financial document Darius kept at home, framing it as a simple security check to rule out any conflict of interest. Simone did not yet understand that Evelyn cared far more about her husband than she had ever admitted. And when Evelyn later scanned the list of officials with authority to suspend the loan, she froze on a single line, an approval code marked DW01, and turned to her chief financial officer, Malcolm Vance, demanding to know exactly who Darius Whitmore really was. The next morning, Hartwell Meridian convened an emergency meeting at its Atlanta headquarters, Evelyn projecting calm in front of staff, while privately seething behind closed doors because the funds still had not moved. Malcolm explained that the loan had been suspended by someone with authority above the credit committee itself, and Evelyn ordered his identity confirmed within the hour. She summoned Simone and pressed her for details about Darius, his schedule, his associates, the documents he read late at night. But Simone had nothing concrete to offer, admitting she had never bothered to learn the exact name of the small consulting firm he worked for. Evelyn's disappointment sharpened into something colder, and she began hinting that Simone's long-promised promotion now depended entirely on her ability to solve what Evelyn called the Darius problem, which stunned Simone since the divorce itself had been Evelyn's idea from the 12th start. The conversation slowly revealed a pattern Simone had never let herself see clearly. For months, Evelyn had cultivated her, inviting her to private dinners, surrounding her with wealth, repeatedly framing Darius as an anchor, holding her back from the life she deserved, all in the hope that Simone could pressure her husband into Washington, approving the loan without ever knowing his true position. Once it became clear, Simone had no leverage over a man whose real power she did not even suspect, Evelyn pivoted toward divorce. Instead, calculating that an isolated, dependent Simone would be easier to control. Meanwhile, at a private New York office, belonging to Whitmore Sovereign Capital, Darius walked through a discreet entrance, and the entire leadership team rose to their feet, the audience finally witnessing the full scale of the empire Simone had never known her husband commanded. On a large screen, the complete structure of Hartwell Meridian's debt appeared, and Darius discovered that $640 million had been quietly routed through 3 shell companies connected to Evelyn personally. He instructed his team to withhold conclusions until they had direct evidence ordered protection for any internal witness willing to come forward and set aside emergency funds to cover payroll for Hartwell employees in case the company ended up under receivership. Malcolm secretly reached out to Rochelle that same afternoon, revealing he possessed the original, unaltered versions of financial reports Evelyn had forced him to falsify, and though he feared prosecution for the documents he had already signed, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for the full truth, eventually coming to light. Back in Atlanta, Simone returned home to collect her belongings and found Darius's home office completely emptied. Nothing left but a desk, a wedding photo, and a short note explaining that he would not fight to keep someone who had already chosen to leave, but that he would fight to protect the truth she was currently being forced to hide. Still convinced her husband was simply performing an elaborate act of wounded pride, Simone delivered an old hard drive of his to Evelyn, unaware it contained nothing but publicly available analysis. When Evelyn's security team ran a check, the software license traced directly back to Whitmore Sovereign Capital, and the color drained from her face as she realized the surname controlling her company's future was the same surname sitting across from her at leadership dinners for over a year. Determined to project confidence. Despite the unpaid loan, Evelyn hosted an investor celebration anyway, intending to announce Simone as the new global head of communications before the market could sense any weakness. And beforehand, she pressed Simone to sign a formal statement affirming that every figure shared with investors was accurate, even though Simone had never personally verified any of it. Simone hesitated only briefly before Evelyn reminded her that the promotion, the apartment, and the equity all depended on loyalty, and she signed. In the hallway outside, Malcolm warned her that the numbers were compromised, and that Evelyn was using her signature to shift legal exposure away from herself. But Simone dismissed him as bitter or self-serving. During her speech that night, Evelyn announced the $4 billion rescue had been secured, sending the company's stock climbing in after hours trading. And just as she prepared to introduce Simone as the newest executive, the doors opened to reveal Darius in a black tuxedo flanked by Rochelle and 2 members of the Credit Oversight Committee, no longer resembling the modest husband Simone had once dismissed as unambitious. Bankers, attorneys, and major investors crossed the room to shake his hand, several addressing him as Mr. Chairman, and Simone assumed for a moment that they had mistaken him for someone else entirely. She scanned the crowd for the man she had spent 8 years reducing in her own mind to a footnote, searching for some visible sign that this was a mistake. A trick of the lighting, a coincidence of names, but the deference in the room was too specific, too fluent, the kind of respect that only comes from years of people needing something from you and receiving it fairly. A senior partner from one of the largest banks in the country leaned in to thank Darius for extending a grace period on an unrelated deal months earlier, and Simone realized with a sinking clarity that an entire financial world had he been quietly orbiting her husband while she complained to her friends that he lacked vision. Evelyn pulled Darius aside and tried for warmth, insisting the divorce was a private matter that should not interfere with a deal beneficial to everyone involved. But Darius told her plainly that the loan had not been suspended over a marriage. It had been suspended over falsified, reporting conflicting, collateral, and unexplained transfers of money she could not account for. When Evelyn tried to shift blame onto Malcolm, Darius laid a printed record on the table bearing her own electronic signature, and Simone stepped between them. just as Evelyn spun the confrontation into a story about a bitter husband seeking revenge for being served divorce papers. Darius refused to argue the point, demanding instead that Evelyn publicly correct her earlier claim that the loan had already been secured, a correction she refused because it would send the stock crashing within minutes. He walked to the stage before she could stop him and told the room without revealing the ongoing investigation that Whitmore Sovereign Capital had made no final decision and that any statement suggesting otherwise was false. The room dissolved into confusion as attendees whispered and reporters reached for their phones, and Simone finally saw his name and title displayed. On the overhead screen, Darius Whitmore, founder and executive chairman of Whitmore Sovereign Capital, the man she had signed away in a folder of legal paper less than a day earlier. Evelyn leaned close to Simone before security could usher her away, and warned that if she could not convince her husband to approve the loan before noon the following day, Simone alone would be left holding the consequences. In the parking structure afterward, Simone confronted Darius, furious that he had hidden a fortune worth tens of billions of dollars, accusing him of humiliating her in front of the entire financial world. He answered that money was far from the only thing she had never bothered to ask about, that she had never once asked why he stayed awake until 3 in the morning, or why senior bankers occasionally called their home late at night. He reminded her of the early years, the small apartment, the promise she once made that she needed nothing but honesty and loyalty, and how that promise had quietly eroded once Evelyn began pulling her into a world of borrowed glamour, mocking his plain clothes, and slowly excluding him from her professional life. Simone argued that hiding his fortune was its own form of betrayal, and Darius admitted he had waited too long to tell her, but explained that the fund was never a personal account he could spend freely, that he answered to investors' pension funds and thousands of employees whose futures depended on his discipline. He showed her gently but plainly that their house had been paid off through a trust he established long before, not from her salary, and that the leadership program she believed she had earned entirely on her own had been funded by an organization under his fund, though she had still passed every stage of selection herself. He told her he had always believed in her ability, but he could no longer shield her from the consequences of the choices she was making now, and when she asked whether he intended to punish her by killing the loan, he answered simply that a qualified company would be approved and a fraudulent one would not, and that she no longer had the standing to turn his professional duty into a weapon in their marriage. That night marked the first time Simone understood that his power had never come from arrogance, only from principle, and the realization terrified her more than his wealth ever could. Evelyn called her back to the office almost immediately, offering $12 million and a senior title in exchange for a signed statement, claiming Darius had used insider information obtained through Simone to manipulate the loan process, promising that cooperation would shield her from any legal consequence tied to the false statements she had already signed. When Simone asked what would happen if she refused, Evelyn played a manipulated recording that made her sound complicit in the fraud from the beginning, and Simone finally understood she had never been chosen as a successor, only kept as a convenient scapegoat waiting to be used. The office Evelyn had chosen for the conversation was the same one where she had first told Simone she saw a version of herself in her, and the same one where she had once poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch and talked about breaking ceilings together, as if the two of them were building something, side by side, rather than one woman quietly grooming another for sacrifice. Simone noticed for the first time how carefully staged the room, felt the lighting angled just so, a second chair positioned to catch a clean profile, and she understood on some instinctive level that she was not being persuaded, she was being filmed. Simone pretended to consider the offer buying time by requesting changes to the payment terms, while secretly activating the recording feature on her smartwatch, and in her impatience, Evelyn admitted far more than she intended. She confirmed she had known the revenue figures were inflated, had deliberately used Simone's signature to redirect legal liability, had created the shell. Companies herself had pushed the divorce, specifically to make Simone easier to control, and believed Darius would ultimately approve the loan to protect his wife from prosecution. Refusing to sign, Simone walked out despite an attempt by Evelyn's security team to detain her under the pretense of protecting confidential material, only escaping when she threatened to call the police. And she rushed straight to Rochelle's office, even though Darius was unreachable in a credit committee meeting. Rochelle, still technically representing Darius in the divorce, was reluctant at first, until Simone made clear she had not come to save her marriage, but to stop innocent employees from being blamed for a scheme they never created. After hearing the recording, Rochelle warned Simone that cooperation would not erase her own responsibility, since she had signed statements without verifying them, and Simone accepted that consequence without argument. Inside the credit committee meeting, some members pushed to cancel the loan outright and seize the pledged collateral immediately, a move that would protect investors but could bankrupt Hartwell Meridian within days, while Darius proposed a different path, entirely refusing to hand funds directly to the existing leadership, placing the company under special oversight, removing Evelyn from financial control, protecting payroll and functioning divisions, launching an independent investigation into the missing $640 million, and converting a portion of the loan into equity if fraud were confirmed. One senior partner argued that mercy toward a fraudulent company was not the fund's job, that their obligation began and ended with their own investors, and that thousands of jobs elsewhere in the country had already been lost to companies far less compromised than Hartwell Meridian. Darius did not dispute the math. He reminded the room instead that the fund had been built on the belief that discipline and compassion were not opposites, that a company could be punished for fraud without punishing the employees who had nothing to do with creating it, and that the difference between vengeance and accountability was precision. The committee gave him 6 hours to produce evidence strong enough to justify the plan, and Rochelle handed him the recording of Evelyn's confession shortly afterward. Hearing his estranged wife's boss admit to manipulating their marriage was a wound Darius absorbed privately, forcing himself to stay focused on the financial misconduct rather than the personal betrayal layered beneath it, and he agreed to meet Simone at his firm's offices. She apologized for underestimating him, but Darius withheld immediate forgiveness, asking instead whether she regretted betraying him or simply regretted that Evelyn had betrayed her first, a question Simone found she could not answer. Honestly, in that moment, he informed her that Evelyn had already called an emergency board session, intended to fire Malcolm, destroy accounting records, and place the entire blame on Simone before the day was over. At Hartwell Meridian, Evelyn assembled the full board and claimed the loan suspension was nothing more than a personal act of revenge from a jilted husband, presenting a forged statement bearing Simone's electronic signature that accused Darius of threatening the company after receiving the Powsand divorce papers. Board chairman Grant Holloway remained skeptical, but allowed Evelyn to continue, and when Malcolm was summoned and ordered to surrender his laptop, he refused, revealing the data had already been backed up with outside counsel. Evelyn ordered his termination on the spot, but moments later, Darius, Rochelle, and Simone entered together, alongside an independent audit team. Darius announcing that Whitmore Sovereign Capital retained oversight rights under the preliminary credit agreement itself. When Evelyn attempted to exclude Darius on grounds of marital conflict of interest, Rochelle explained that he had already recused himself from any decision touching Simone's personal assets, while an independent committee continued reviewing the loan, though the fund still retained the right to protect its pledged collateral. Simone then stood before the board and admitted openly that she had signed statements she never fully verified, refusing to place the entire blame on Evelyn alone, and that honesty made her testimony land with far more weight than a simple accusation ever could. She played the recording of Evelyn offering $12 million to falsely implicate Darius, and when Evelyn insisted the audio had been altered, Malcolm produced the original emails, unedited financial reports, and revision logs, proving Evelyn had personally ordered the false numbers. Grant demanded an explanation for the $640 million transferred outside the company, and Evelyn claimed it was a reserve fund for a confidential acquisition, until Darius pointed out that the shell companies receiving that money shared a registered address with Evelyn's own personal trust. Cornered, Evelyn turned her attack toward Darius, instead arguing that a man who hid his identity from his own wife could hardly be trusted by anyone in that room. And Darius did not deny the failure in his marriage, only asking how his silence toward Simone had given Evelyn the right to steal $640 million. The room fell silent, and Grant called for a vote to suspend Evelyn from her role during the investigation. The tally splitting evenly at first, as several members feared losing the loan altogether if she were removed. Darius informed the board that the fund would only continue considering the loan if Evelyn was stripped of financial control immediately, and one member switched their vote narrowly, suspending her. Before security could escort her from the building, Evelyn smiled and revealed she had already triggered a cross-default clause, meaning that if the full $4 billion did not move before midnight, every other lender attached to the company could seize its assets simultaneously. Checking the time, Darius realized they had exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes to save a company without saving the woman who had nearly destroyed it. Darius set up a crisis response room directly inside Hartwell Meridian's headquarters, assigning Malcolm to confirm the precise debts coming due Rochelle, to contact regulators, and secure data preservation orders. Grant to convene the other creditors and Simone to manage internal communications and prevent panic among employees, while his own team assessed which divisions of the company were genuinely profitable enough to save. Monitors lined the walls, showing live cash positions across 11 subsidiaries, and every few minutes a new figure would refresh, sometimes worse than the last. And the room filled with the particular tension of people watching a countdown. They could not pause. Simone wanted a larger role in the negotiations, but Darius limited her to tasks within her actual expertise, refusing to let guilt or emotion distort a process that required absolute discipline. At one point, Simone tried to insert herself into a call with a senior creditor, hoping to smooth over the tension using the same charm that had carried her through years of client relationships, and Darius pulled her aside afterward, not unkindly, and told her that this was not a communications problem. She could talk her way out of it. Was a solvency problem that required numbers, verified numbers, moving faster than fear could spread through the building. She accepted the correction, swallowed her pride, and returned to drafting internal messages instead, watching from a distance as her husband moved through the crisis with a steadiness she had never once witnessed during their marriage calm, even as the clock above the pride main screen ticked past 10 o'clock with the deadline, still hours away. Even suspended Evelyn used a personal phone to contact a rival hedge fund offering to sell strategic assets at a discount if they helped her regain control. And Rochelle discovered the attempted transfer in time to secure an emergency order blocking any transfer of company property. One major creditor refused to extend its deadline, threatening to seize $900 million in assets within the hour, unless payment arrived immediately, and Darius responded with a 2-tier rescue structure built to satisfy both urgency and accountability. The first tier released an immediate $1 million bridge loan from Whitmore Sovereign Capital, used exclusively to cover maturing debt and protect employee payroll, while the remaining $2.9 billion would only be released once the board formally removed. Evelyn accepted a full forensic audit, froze every shell company connected to her, added her personal assets as additional collateral, and committed new leadership to selling off underperforming divisions. Several board members objected that the arrangement would give Darius's fund significant ownership in the company, and he told them plainly they were free to refuse, but after midnight, there might be no company left to argue over. Simone discovered that Evelyn had already prepared a press statement, accusing Darius of seizing the company out of personal revenge, a release capable of scaring off the remaining creditors within minutes, and Simone used her last remaining access to internal communications to block it, replacing it with a more honest statement describing a company undergoing restructuring under independent oversight. When Evelyn called to curse at her, reminding Simone that she herself had once called Darius a failure, Simone answered quietly that her greatest mistake had never been failing to notice his wealth, but failing to keep noticing the kind of man he actually was. With 12 minutes remaining before the deadline, the board accepted every condition, and Darius entered the final approval code himself, releasing the $1,100,000,000 into a supervised account outside the reach of existing management, prompting creditors to agree to a temporary hold on seizing collateral. Hartwell Meridian survived the night, but Evelyn lost the company entirely, and just as the exhausted room began to exhale, federal investigators walked through the front doors, carrying a warrant tied to the missing $640 million. In the days that followed, the story spread through financial circles, the way a fire moves through dry brush reporters camped outside the Hartwell Meridian building, and analysts openly debated on business broadcasts whether the company could survive the scandal at all. Evelyn tried one final gambit, reaching out to former allies on the board and offering to testify against Darius in exchange for leniency, claiming his marriage to Simone had given him improper access to internal information from the start. The claim collapsed within a day, once investigators reviewed the timeline and confirmed that Darius had frozen the loan before Simone ever mentioned a single detail about the company's finances, and that if anything, his own wife had known less about his position than the strangers he did business with. The investigation confirmed that Evelyn had routed company funds through a web of shell entities, purchased private real estate, and concealed mounting losses to prop up the stock price, resulting in charges of financial fraud obstruction, witness tampering, and corporate document falsification. Simone was not spared, entirely forced to testify before regulators and admit she had signed public statements without verifying their accuracy. And although her cooperation and the recorded evidence kept her from facing criminal charges, she was barred from executive roles at any publicly traded company for 3 years and forfeited every bonus she had not yet received. Hartwell Meridian underwent a full restructuring, with Grant temporarily leading the board, Malcolm promoted to chief financial officer, with newly independent authority and thousands of jobs preserved through the process. Whitmore's sovereign capital did not seize the company at a discount, despite holding significant leverage, since Darius insisted on transparent valuation and created a shared benefit fund for employees in the event of a full recovery, proving, to everyone watching, that the suspension had never been an act of personal revenge against Simone. During the divorce proceedings, Rochelle confirmed that Simone retained a legitimate claim to assets accumulated during the marriage, and Darius made no attempt to hide funds or manipulate the settlement to avoid a fair division. He offered her the house, her retirement accounts, and a reasonable settlement while keeping ownership of the fund itself, since it predated their marriage and involved outside investors with independent claims. Simone declined to push for more than what felt fair, telling Rochelle she refused to turn genuine regret into a negotiating tactic. The two of them met again at the same restaurant where Simone had once slid divorce papers across the table, and this time she arrived carrying the pocket watch Darius had given her that night, finally opened, revealing an engraving from her late father that read, "Do not mistake silence for weakness." Simone apologized for judging Darius through the narrow lens of status symbols, admitting that his hidden identity had created a distance neither of them had been willing to face honestly, and Darius accepted the apology without using her earlier betrayal as an excuse to dismiss his own mistakes. When Simone asked if there was still a chance for them, Darius answered that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same decision, that he could forgive her enough to let them both move forward, but trust could not be rebuilt through a single apology delivered over one dinner. Simone cried without begging, then signed a revised settlement, one finally free of the unfair terms Evelyn had once helped design. And before leaving the restaurant, Darius told her he still did not know whether their story had truly ended, or was only now being forced to start over on the foundation of the truth. 6 months later, Hartwell Meridian had been renamed Meridian Renewal Group to mark the beginning of a new chapter, having sold off its weakest assets, recovered a portion of the funds Evelyn diverted, and resumed timely payments on its restructured loan. Evelyn remained under indictment, awaiting trial, her properties accounts and illicit holdings frozen to compensate the company and its investors, while Darius turned down the board's offer to become chief executive, choosing instead to remain focused on credit, oversight, and daily operations to leaders with the right expertise. He established a whistleblower protection program named after his late father, giving employees a safe way to report fraud without fear of retaliation. And Malcolm went on to lead the company's financial rebuilding, while Grant stepped down as chairman, accepting responsibility for failing to properly supervise Evelyn during her years in power. In his resignation letter, Grant wrote that oversight without genuine curiosity was just decoration, and that he had spent years admiring Evelyn's results without ever asking hard enough questions about how those results were produced. A lesson he hoped the next generation of the board would not have to learn the same costly way. The rebuilt company kept nearly all of its original workforce, and within 2 quarters it returned to modest profitability, its stock trading far below its former peak, but climbing steadily as investors slowly regained confidence in leadership they could actually verify. Malcolm instituted quarterly independent reviews of every division, a policy that would have exposed Evelyn's fraud years earlier had it existed before, and employees who once whispered fearfully about retaliation began speaking openly in meetings for the first time in years. Simone no longer had the luxury apartment, the assistant, or the company car, and instead took a lower-paying position advising small minority-owned businesses on building transparent governance systems. The work paid far less, but for the first time in years, she was no longer pretending to be someone else, and she never used her connection to Darius to attract clients or make her past marriage part of her professional story. She and Darius spoke only when finalizing the last of the divorce paperwork, though he quietly followed her progress through the public record of her new work without ever reaching out unprompted. One afternoon, Simone was invited to speak at a corporate ethics forum, and without naming Darius directly, she described how she had once confused power with worth allowed a superior to weaponize her resentment inside a struggling marriage. Signed documents she never fully understood in exchange for recognition, and hurt the most loyal person in her life by mistaking his quiet strength for failure. Her voice caught only once, when she described handing a folder of divorce papers to a man who had never once raised his voice to her, and she told the audience that the hardest part of rebuilding a life was admitting how much of the old one had been built on assumptions she never bothered to test. Darius sat in the back of the room that day, unnoticed, and waited for her outside once her remarks ended. He had told himself he was only there out of curiosity, some professional interest in how the story had been reshaped in her mind, but standing outside the venue in the late afternoon light, he understood he had come because some part of him still wanted to know if the woman speaking on that stage was the same woman who had once shared a small apartment with him and asked for nothing but honesty. Simone did not ask whether he wanted to reconcile, only thanked him for saving the company, without ever trying to salvage her reputation in the process, and he handed her the pocket watch, once more, its strap repaired after breaking the day. She left their old apartment. He told her that her father had left behind a warning that had proven exactly right, but that he himself had needed to learn that silence carried on too long could become its own kind of dishonesty. Simone asked if they could share a cup of coffee, not as husband and wife, but as two people finally willing to speak the truth to each other, and Darius agreed. They crossed the street into an ordinary coffee shop. No driver waiting outside, no private room, no contract worth billions of dollars. Sitting between them, just two mismatched chairs, by a window and the low hum of espresso machine that neither of them owned or controlled. Simone noticed how strange it felt to sit across from him without an agenda, without a folder, without either of them performing for an audience that no longer existed. And for a moment, she let herself simply watch him stir sugar into his coffee, the same unhurried way he used to when they were young, and broke, and certain of nothing except each other. For the first time in years, Simone asked the question she should have asked, long before any of it began, what he actually wanted to do with his life. Not what his title said, not what his balance sheet implied, but what he wanted. And Darius smiled and told her that she had finally asked. He answered slowly, admitting that somewhere between building the fund and protecting its secrecy, he had forgotten to ask himself the same question that power had become a kind of armor he wore. So consistently, he no longer remembered what he looked like without it. Simone listened the way she used to listen, before Evelyn taught her that listening was a currency to be spent strategically and for the length of one ordinary cup of coffee. Neither of them reached for their phones. Neither of them mentioned lawyers or boards or deadlines, and whatever came next between them remained for once refreshingly unwritten. Evelyn lost an empire because she believed every person around her could eventually be bought. Simone nearly lost her future because she believed a man's worth could be measured only by what he chose to display. But Darius learned the harder lesson of all that power built quietly over 16 years could rescue a $4 billion company overnight, while only honesty offered without hesitation had any real chance of rescuing what remained of a price. Marriage built on secrets.